Welcome back to Legacy Revenge.
My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 50 years old, a retired high school librarian.
And 3 weeks ago, my entire family staged what they called a surprise intervention on my 50th birthday to
pressure me into signing away my grandmother's house.
They invited 22 relatives to my mother's home in Asheville, North Carolina.
Decorated the dining room with cheap silver
banners that said Happy 50th, and waited until I had blown out my
candles before my father stood
up and read a 4-page document accusing
me of being selfish, ungrateful,
and tearing this family apart. My mother followed with a list she had clearly prepared for weeks. A list of every childhood failure she could remember, going back to when I was 7 years old and broke a porcelain figurine in her china cabinet.
She read it out loud in front of everyone,
her voice trembling with rehearsed grief,
while my brothers nodded in solemn
agreement, and my sister-in-law dabbed her eyes with a tissue she had not actually used. The cake was still on the table. The candles had only just stopped smoking.
And there I sat in a navy blue dress I had bought myself for this occasion,
listening to my own family describe me as the villain of a story I had not been allowed to write. I did not cry.
I did not argue. I sat perfectly still and let them finish.
Because what they did not know, what none of them had any idea about, was that I had brought something with me too. Tucked inside my leather handbag, sitting on the chair beside me,
was a single manila folder that
would turn their entire intervention into the most expensive
mistake any of them had ever made.
By the end of that evening,
3 of my relatives were in tears. My mother was screaming. My brother Daniel had locked himself in the bathroom. And the house they had spent 2 years trying to steal from me was permanently, legally, and undeniably mine.
This is the story of how a family who thought
they could ambush a quiet woman discovered that quiet does not mean unprepared.
To understand how we got to that birthday dinner,
you have to understand my grandmother Beatrice. She was the matriarch of the Whitfield family,
a woman born in 1928 who survived the Depression,
buried 2 husbands, raised 4 children, and accumulated quietly over decades a beautiful 3-bedroom
Victorian house on Chestnut Hill that was worth,
by the time she passed in 2019, approximately $640,000. The house sat on a half-acre lot with a wraparound porch, original hardwood floors, and a kitchen she had renovated herself in 1987 with money she earned giving piano lessons. To my family, that house was an asset. To my grandmother, it was the only thing she truly owned in this world.
And to me, it was the only place I had
ever felt completely seen. My
grandmother Beatrice and I had a relationship
that none of my siblings ever understood, and none of my parents ever respected. From the time I was 8 years old, I spent every summer at her house on
Chestnut Hill, while my brothers Daniel and
Marcus were enrolled in expensive baseball camps, and my younger sister, Caroline, was sent to ballet intensives. I was quietly dropped off at Grandma Beatrice's front porch with a single suitcase and instructions to stay out of trouble. My parents treated those summers as free childcare. My grandmother treated them as the most important months of her year. She taught me how to play piano, how to bake sourdough bread from a starter she had kept alive for 40 years, and how to read the Sunday newspaper from front to back, including the obituaries, because, as she said,
those are the only honest stories left in the paper. She listened to me.
She remembered every book I mentioned. She kept a notebook of my favorite recipes and updated it every time I visited.
When I was 16 and going through the worst depression of my adolescence,
she was the one who drove
3 hours to pick me up from school
after I called her crying. Not my mother.
Not my father. Her.
My siblings did not have that relationship with her because they did not want one.
Daniel was 3 years older than me, charming, athletic, and my father's clear favorite. He became a real estate developer in Charlotte and made very good money flipping properties. He bought from elderly homeowners at below market prices. Marcus was 2 years younger than me. A chiropractor with cocaine problem, he hid behind a Prius and a yoga wife. Caroline was the baby of the family, 7 years younger. A stay-at-home mother of 3 whose husband worked in pharmaceutical sales and whose entire identity revolved around appearing wealthier than she actually was. All 3 of them had visited Grandma Beatrice maybe twice a year, usually at Christmas, usually for less than an hour.
When she passed away in October of 2019 at the age of 91,
they showed up to her funeral, wearing designer black and crying for the carrots my sister-in-law insisted on bringing. I sat alone in the front pew, because I was the only person in that church who had actually known her. The reading of the will took place 2 weeks later in the office of her attorney, a soft-spoken man named Howard Kessler, who had managed her affairs for 30 years. My parents, my 3 siblings, my sister-in-law and I crowded into a small conference room while Howard slid documents across the polished oak table. My grandmother's estate was modest in terms of liquid assets, about $42,000 in a savings account, which she divided equally among her 4 grandchildren. But the house on Chestnut Hill, the property worth over $600,000, was left entirely to me. Not divided, not shared, mine alone.
the room went silent.
My mother's face turned the color of curdled milk. My father's hand tightened round his pen until his knuckles turned white.
And Daniel, my charming older brother,
leaned back in his chair and smiled the kind of smile that meant the war had just begun.
The first attempt to take the house
From me came exactly 11 days after the will was read. My father called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying the forced warmth of a man about to ask for something he believed was already his. He explained that the family had been talking, and they all agreed it would be best if the house was sold immediately and the proceeds divided equally among the 4 siblings. He framed it as fairness. He framed it as what Grandma Beatrice would have actually wanted, even though her will said the exact opposite. He told me that $160,000 would set me up nicely, that I did not need a whole house at my age, and that, as a single woman without children, I had no real use for the property. I listened politely. Then I told him that the house was not for sale, that my grandmother's wishes were clear in the legal documents, and that I would be honoring those wishes by keeping it. My father went quiet. Then he said, "Eleanor, this is going to cause problems." "I am trying to help you avoid them." I told him I appreciated his concern. I hung up. The problem started the next morning. Daniel called first. His pitch was more polished than my father's because he was a real estate developer who negotiated for a living. He offered to help me out by buying the house himself at a generous family discount. $400,000 cash, well below market value. He explained that as a developer, he could turn the property quickly and that I would have the money in my account within 30 days. I told him no. He pressed harder. He said he had buyers lined up. He said the neighborhood was changing and the value would soon drop. He said I was making an emotional decision instead of a financial one. I told him my grandmother had not left me the house to be flipped by my brother for a profit. He laughed coldly and said, "Suit yourself, Eleanor. But you are not going to be able to handle this alone." Then he hung up. Marcus called the next day, drunk or high, slurring his words and complaining that I was being unfair to the family. Caroline texted me a long message about how my decision was hurting the children because she had hoped to use her share of the house sale to fund private school tuition for her oldest daughter. My mother called me crying twice that week, asking how I could be so selfish, asking how I could spit on my grandmother's memory by refusing to share what was rightfully a family asset. I let all of it wash over me. I did not respond emotionally to any of them. Instead, I did what I had learned to do during the worst years of my life. When my mother's verbal abuse pushed me into therapy at the age of 22, I documented everything. I saved every voicemail. I screenshot every text. I made notes after every phone call with the date, the time, and the exact words used. I built a record that would prove invaluable 2 years later. On the night they thought they had me cornered at my own birthday dinner. For 2 years after my grandmother's death, my family conducted a quiet, persistent campaign to convince me to give up the house. It was never one big confrontation. It was 1,000 small ones. At every family gathering, someone would casually mention, "How nice it would be if we could all share Grandma's legacy." At every holiday, my mother would sigh dramatically about how unfair it was that one grandchild had been chosen above the others at Daniel's daughter's 3rd birthday party. My sister-in-law, Vanessa, cornered me in the kitchen and told me, in the gentlest possible voice, that the family was beginning to lose respect for me because of my refusal to share. I smiled, thanked her for her honesty, and went back to slicing the birthday cake. I had spent my entire adult life learning that the people who tell you that family is losing respect for you are usually the same people who never respected you in the first place. I moved into the house on Chestnut Hill 6 months after my grandmother passed. I sold my small condo in town, used part of the proceeds to update the plumbing and electrical, and turned the upstairs guest bedroom into a piano studio where I gave lessons to neighborhood children 3 afternoons a week. I planted a vegetable garden in the backyard where my grandmother had once grown tomatoes. I refinished the front porch with my own hands, sanding and staining each board until it gleamed in the afternoon sun. The house became mine in every meaningful way, not just legally. The neighbors knew me. The mailman called me by name. The little girl across the street brought me drawings she had made of the wisteria growing along my fence. For the first time in my life, I had a home that nobody could take away from me, or so I believed. In early spring of this year, about 4 months before my 50th birthday, my mother began calling more frequently than usual. She was suddenly very interested in my health, my work, my plans for the future. She asked careful questions about my finances, about whether I had a will of my own, about what I planned to do with the house when I got older. I answered vaguely because something about the change in her tone made me uneasy. Then she started inviting me to lunch more often. She suggested family dinners. She proposed a milestone birthday celebration for my 50th. Something special, something the whole family could be part of. She insisted on hosting it at her own house in Asheville. 2 hours from Chestnut Hill, because she wanted to handle all the details herself. I should have known then. I should have recognized the pattern. But part of me, the 8-year-old part that had spent every summer wishing my mother would love me, the way Grandma Beatrice did, wanted to believe she meant it. I accepted the invitation. I drove to Asheville on the afternoon of my birthday with a small bag of clothes and a heart that still, after all these years, hoped for something it had never been given. The drive from Chestnut Hill to my parents' house in Asheville took 2 hours and 17 minutes.
I arrived at 5 o'clock on a Saturday evening in late September.
The air crisp with the first hints of autumn. The trees along their cul-de-sac just beginning to turn gold at the edges. My mother greeted me at the door wearing a cream-colored blouse and a smile that was a 1/4 inch too wide. She hugged me with a kind of pressure that suggested obligation rather than affection, and she led me into the dining room where 22 relatives were already seated and waiting. I had been told it would be a small family dinner, maybe 10 people. Instead, every aunt, every uncle,
Every cousin who lived within 100 miles was
crammed around a dining table, extended with 2 folding sections,
and draped in the white tablecloth that did not quite
reach the floor.
The room smelled of pot roast, candle wax, and something else underneath, something tense and metallic that I could not place at first. Later, I would recognize it as the smell of a trap being set. I sat at the head of the table because my mother insisted, calling me the birthday girl, fussing with my napkin, pouring me wine I had not asked for.
My father sat at the opposite end. My brothers and sister flanked the long sides with their spouses.
The conversation during dinner was strange, too cheerful, too rehearsed. Every story someone told ended with a meaningful glance in my direction.
Every compliment about the food was followed by a comment about how lucky
I was to have such a devoted family. I ate slowly, watching, listening.
My instincts beginning to scream warnings I tried to ignore.
After the main course was cleared, my mother brought out cake. It was sheet cake from the grocery store, decorated with chip blue frosting and the words, "Happy 50th, Eleanor," written in shaky cursive. She placed it in front of me with great ceremony. 50 candles flickered in the dim light. The family sang. I blew out the candles. I made no wish because I had stopped wishing on candles when I was 12.
And then, before I could even pick up the cake knife, my father stood up.
He was holding a stack of papers, full of pages, single-spaced, the edges slightly crumpled from being held tightly. He cleared his throat. The room went silent.
He looked at me with an expression I had seen on his face many times throughout my life.
The expression he wore when he was about to deliver a verdict, disguised as a conversation.
"Eleanor," he began,
his voice carrying the weight of a man who had rehearsed this moment for weeks.
"We are gathered here tonight not just to celebrate your birthday,
but to have a long overdue conversation about your behavior toward this family." I set down my wine glass, my hands hidden under the table,
found the leather handle of my purse and rested there gently.
Whatever was about to happen, I had come prepared.
My father read from his 4-page document for almost 11 minutes.
I timed it later by checking the clock on my phone. He began by listing what he called my patterns of selfishness, starting with my refusal to share the proceeds of Grandma Beatrice's house. He spoke about how the family had given me time to come to the right decision on my own. how they had been patient, how they had hoped that maturity and reflection would lead me to do what was fair. When that did not happen, he said, the family had no choice but to come together and address the situation directly. He used phrases like, for your own good and out of love, and because we care about your relationship with all of us. He accused me of being cold, of isolating myself, of valuing a building over the people who had raised me. He said the family had decided collectively that I needed to sign the document transferring ownership of the house into a family trust with all 4 siblings as equal beneficiaries, and that this transfer would happen tonight, in front of everyone as a gesture of reconciliation. When he finished, my mother stood up. She held her own list, a smaller piece of paper covered in her tight, controlled handwriting. She began to read, and what came out of her mouth was the most painful catalogue I had ever heard. Every childhood failure I had committed since the age of 7 was on that paper. The figurine I broke in the china cabinet. The time I forgot her birthday in 6th grade because I was sick with the flu. A bad report card from 9th grade. A boyfriend she had not approved of in college. The Christmas I missed when I was 26 because I had pneumonia. Every minor disappointment I had ever caused her over 43 years had been documented and saved like ammunition for this exact moment. She read each item slowly, her voice trembling for theatrical effect, occasionally pausing to dab her eyes with a tissue. When she finished, she looked at me and said, Eleanor, you have spent your entire life disappointing this family. Signing the house over tonight is your chance to finally make it right. The room waited. 22 pairs of eyes locked onto me. Daniel had a pen ready.
Vanessa had a stack of legal documents stacked neatly beside her plate,
prepared by a lawyer she had clearly hired in advance. Marcus was nodding slowly. Caroline was crying real tears, the kind that came from her belief that she was about to receive a windfall. My father remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back like a judge waiting for a sentence to be accepted. I sat there for a long moment in complete silence. Then I reached down beside my chair, lifted my leather handbag onto the table, and slowly pulled out the manila folder I had brought with me. I placed it in front of my plate. I looked up at the room, and I smiled the same small, calm smile my grandmother used to wear when she was about to win an argument nobody knew she was having.
Funny, I said.
I brought something tonight,
too. The silence in my mother's dining room was so absolute. You could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway.
22 pairs of eyes stared at the manila folder sitting next to my grocery store.
birthday cake.
My brother Daniel, the real estate developer, let out a short, dismissive laugh.
What is that, Eleanor?
Your diary? I did not look at him. I unclasped the string on the folder and opened it.
Inside was a stack of photocopied documents, meticulously organized with color tabs.
No, Daniel, I said, my voice completely steady.
This is Grandma Beatrice's diary.
Or rather, her financial ledger. The color instantly drained from my father's face.
He knew exactly what I was talking about. Grandma Beatrice had been a piano teacher, a woman who measured timing in perfect beats and kept her life arranged in perfect order. What my family did not know was that for 30 years, she had recorded every single financial transaction she ever made in a hardbound leather ledger she kept locked in a fireproof safe in her basement. When she left me the house, she also left me the safe, the combination, and instructions to only open the ledger if the family ever tried to contest the will. I pulled out the first stack of papers and slid them across the table toward my aunt and uncle, who had been sitting quietly, believing they were there to witness a selfish daughter finally doing the right thing.
Before we discuss who is selfish and who owes what to this family, I said,
looking directly at my mother,
I think we should look at the inheritance
everyone here has already received. I picked up the first highlighted sheet. Let's start with Daniel. In August of 2011, Daniel asked Grandma Beatrice for a $140,000 loan to act as seed money for his first real estate LLC. He signed a promissory note stating he would repay it with 5%
interest within 5 years. I paused,
letting the numbers hang in the air.
according to her ledger
and the bank records her lawyer Howard Kessler provided me. Daniel made exactly 2 payments of $500 before stopping entirely.
he defaulted on the loan,
leaving an elderly woman $139,000
short in her retirement. Daniel's wife,
Vanessa, snapped her head toward her husband.
her mouth fell open.
You told me you got a small business grant, she whispered.
Daniel swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing.
But he could not find his voice.
I turned my attention to my younger sister. Caroline, I said softly. She flinched as if I had thrown something at her.
In 2016,
You cried to Grandma that you
could not afford to send your daughters to the
private school all your friends used.
The extended family, the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had been invited to shame me into submission, were now staring at my siblings in horror. I picked up the next piece of paper. And then there is Marcus, I said,
Looking at my younger brother, who was sinking lower into his chair.
$32,000 in 2018 for what he called a spiritual
Retreat in Arizona.
which was actually a luxury rehab facility because it had drained his joint. Checking account buying cocaine. Grandma paid it so his wife wouldn't find out and leave him. Marcus buried his face in his hands. His yoga instructor wife stood up so fast. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor.
You took money from your grandmother for drugs,
she shrieked. But I was not finished. I turned to the 2 people sitting at the ends of the table, the ones who had orchestrated this entire ambush.
My parents. And finally, the hosts of this lovely intervention, I said.
My voice ringing clear and cold across the china plates. Mom, Dad, in 2005, you took out a second mortgage on this very house because Dad made a bad investment in a commercial wiring business that went bankrupt. When the bank threatened to foreclose in 2008, you went to Grandma Beatrice. She gave you $85,000
from her late husband's
life insurance policy to save your home. I looked around the room at the 22 faces that had judged me just 15 minutes earlier.
My siblings and my parents took a combined
total of $321,000 from Beatrice Whitfield while she was alive. None of it was ever repaid. They drained her cash, her retirement, and her savings. The only thing she had left to her name when she died was the house on Chestnut Hill, and she left it to me because I was the only person in this
family who never asked her for a single
dollar.
The silence in the dining
room was completely shattered. My Aunt Clara, my mother's oldest sister, stood up. Her hands were shaking. She looked at my mother with absolute disgust. "You told us Eleanor stole the house," Clara said, her voice rising. "You told us she manipulated Beatrice on her deathbed. You lied to us to get us here to bully your own daughter, so you could steal the last piece of property your mother owned." My mother tried to speak, but only a wet, pathetic sob came out. Her rehearsed tears were gone.
These were the real
tears of a narcissist whose mask had just been ripped off in
front of her entire audience.
My father stood up, his face purple with rage.
"That is enough, Eleanor.
Those were family matters handled privately. It has nothing to do with the fact that Chestnut Hill property should belong to the family trust. Now sign the papers," Daniel brought. I looked at the stack of legal documents sitting next to Daniel's plate. I actually laughed. It was not a bitter laugh. It was genuine amusement at their sheer arrogance. "I am afraid I cannot sign those papers, Dad," I said, "even if I wanted to, which I absolutely do not." "Those documents are legally worthless," Daniel scoffed, trying to regain some of his lost authority.
"My lawyer drafted those documents, Eleanor."
"They are ironclad." I reached into my folder one last time and pulled out a single sheet of paper bearing the heavy embossed seal of the state of North Carolina. "Your lawyer drafted a transfer of deed for a property owned by an individual," I explained, sliding the document down the table so everyone could see the seal. "But I do not own the house on Chestnut Hill. Not."
Daniel's eyes narrowed.
"What are you talking about?" I smiled. 2 years ago, when you all started harassing me to sell, I sat down with Grandma's attorney, Howard Kessler. He advised me to protect the asset. I transferred the deed of the Chestnut Hill property into an irrevocable blind trust. I am the sole trustee, but the trust legally owns the house. The bylaws of the trust specifically state that the property cannot be sold,
transferred, or divided under any circumstances for the next 50 years.
And any legal attempt to force a sale automatically triggers a penalty clause that strips the contesting party of any right to communicate with the trustee. I looked at Daniel,
whose jaw had dropped.
"In simple terms, Daniel, I literally cannot send the house over to you. I made it legally impossible for myself to do so. Your lawyer charged you too?
$1,000 to draft transfer papers for a house that hasn't been in my name since
2020. I pulled out a final stack of envelopes from my handbag and handed them to the person sitting next to me to pass around. "And these are formal cease and desist letters prepared by my attorney. They are addressed to my parents, Daniel, Marcus, and Caroline.
If any of you contact me regarding this house
or any financial matter ever again, I will file harassment charges, and I will gladly submit Grandma's financial ledger to the IRS so they can investigate the $321,000 in undocumented, untaxed gifts you all received. The collapse of my family happened in a matter of minutes, and it was a spectacular thing to witness." My Aunt Clara threw her napkin onto her plate, grabbed her purse, and walked out the front door without saying goodbye to my mother. Within seconds, 2 of my uncles and 3 cousins followed her. They did not look at my parents. They looked at me, and one of my cousins gave me a small, silent nod of respect.
before disappearing into the hallway.
The extended family, the audience my mother had carefully cultivated to shame me, abandoned the theater in disgust. Marcus's wife was screaming at him in the corner of the dining room, demanding to know how much debt they were actually in. Caroline was sitting in her chair, weeping into her hands, realizing that the $65,000 she stole from her grandmother
was now public knowledge in our family circle.
Daniel sat frozen, staring at the useless legal documents he had paid for.
His real estate developer ego completely shattered by a retired high school librarian. My mother collapsed onto the floor. It was a dramatic, heaving collapse, the kind she used to fake when we were children to get us to stop arguing, but no one rushed to help her up. My father stood over her, completely paralyzed.
The authority he had wielded over me for 50 years was gone,
Evaporated the moment I proved I was holding all the cards. I stood up, smoothed the skirt of my navy blue dress, and carefully placed the ledger copies back into my manila folder. I tied a string.
I picked up my handbag.
I looked down at the grocery store birthday cake with the cheap blue frosting.
I reached out, swiped a small bit of frosting with my index finger, and tasted it.
Vanilla, I said quietly. Grandma Beatrice always remembered I preferred chocolate. I turned to my father, who was staring at me as if he were looking at a stranger. You invited me here to tell me I was tearing this family apart, I said. But the truth is, there was no family to tear apart. There was just a bank account and a group of people angry that the vault was family closed. Do not contact me again.
I am done. I walked out of the dining room, down the hallway,
and out the front door into the cool September night. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away.
I did not look back in the rearview mirror. The weeks following my 50th birthday were the quietest of my entire life.
I had expected a storm, but my legal preparation had built an unbreakable wall around me. The cease and desist letters worked perfectly. My mother did not call. My father did not show up at my door. The only communication I received was a panicked email from Daniel's business account. 3 days after the intervention, he begged me not to send the ledger to the IRS, claiming it would trigger an audit that would destroy his real estate company. He offered a sincere apology for misunderstanding Grandma's wishes. I read the email once, forwarded it to my attorney for the harassment file, and never replied. Silence is the most terrifying answer you can give a manipulator. I let him sweat in the silence. According to the few extended family members I still speak with, the fallout within their circle was catastrophic. My Aunt Clara hosted Thanksgiving that year and explicitly uninvited my parents, telling them she could not break bread with people who stole from their own mother and then tried to steal from their daughter. Marcus and his wife filed for divorce in November. Caroline had to pull her children out of private school because her husband found out about the money she took and took control of their finances. My parents were completely ostracized by their own siblings. The social standing my mother had spent her entire life protecting was reduced to ashes in a single evening. The irony was not lost on me. They had staged an intervention to shame me in front of the family, and instead they had successfully staged their own excommunication. I updated the security system at the Chestnut Hill house and went back to my life. I taught my piano lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I baked sourdough bread using the starter Grandma Beatrice had given me decades ago. I sat on my front porch with a cup of tea, feeling a profound, untouchable peace. I had always believed that defending yourself meant shouting matches and bitter arguments. I learned that defending yourself actually just requires the truth, documented, protected, and delivered without a single tear. It is spring now in Chestnut Hill. The wisteria along my back fence is blooming in thick, heavy clusters of purple, and the hardwood floors of my grandmother's house still creak in the exact same spots they did when I was 8 years old. I will turn 51 this year, and for the first time in my life, I am not dreading my birthday. I will celebrate it here in my home, with neighbors and friends who love me for who I am, not for what property I can sign over to them. Looking back at that night in Asheville, I realize now that they never actually wanted the house because they loved it. They wanted the house because it was the one thing they couldn't control. My siblings and my parents operated under the belief that love is conditional, measured in loans you never intend to repay and properties you feel entitled to steal. Grandma Beatrice knew exactly who they were. That is why she left the ledger for me. She knew that her final act of love was not just giving me a home, but giving me the weapon I would need to defend it. To anyone watching this who has ever been the target of a family intervention that felt more like an execution, silence is not weakness. Sitting quietly while they list your faults does not mean you agree with them. You are allowed to take the inheritance, keep the house, change the locks, and walk away from the people who only value you when you are useful to them. My family staged an intervention to break me. Instead, they handed me the hammer I needed to shatter the illusion of our family forever. The cake they bought me that night fed a roomful of greedy, terrified people, but the truth I served them will last the rest of their lives. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am the sole owner and trustee of the Chestnut Hill estate, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I belong.